Welcome, traveler! Today we are going over the top 10 cards that, in my humble opinion, should be banned in the Commander format. This is Eve. If you're interested, come take a peek into the cauldron. First and foremost, disclaimers. This is obviously a subjective list, and I have no power whatsoever to tell you what you should play and what you shouldn't. If you and your group enjoy playing with these cards, keep doing what you like. Even though I would suggest to try some games cutting these ones just to test it out. You're always in time to add them back later if that's what you like best. This list only takes in account casual play, obviously. If you're playing with the best of the best, anything is fair game. Lastly, this list does not include any cards that the community at large has agreed not to play with. Most stacks and massland destruction cards will fall under this category and for that reason won't be on the list. And now, let's go over some honorable mentions. Heuristic Study is one of the most played cards in the format, despite being on the more expensive side. The biggest reason this card wins games is because people are impatient. If the table agrees to always pay the tax and to destroy the enchantment at the first opportunity, it won't draw any cards. Despite everyone knowing this, there is always a guy that doesn't care and lets the heuristic player draw. This forces the rest of the table to not pay for it, or otherwise they will fall behind, and this card becomes a 3-mana draw 11. Despite this, even if all players agree to pay the tax, the card is still a very strong asymmetric tax piece. Its play pattern is miserable and forces you to ask every time an opponent casts a spell if they paid one. I personally believe it doesn't belong in casual play, but it gives a choice to your opponents, testing their skill, and while most of the time it's correct to pay the one, that's not always the case. Heuristic Study makes people better players if only they would stop complaining about it and start playing around it. That's why, even though it's a very good candidate, I don't believe it goes over the edge. Next, for the honorable mentions, Flawless Maneuver. Magic the Gathering is a game balanced around resources. Cards that cost no mana with very little requirements or drawbacks and high impact effect ignore this rule. This card allows you to develop a strong board using all your resources and then lets you protect all of it against most board wipes. Doesn't get around all of them and can't protect your life total or non-creature permanents. So, while it's a very powerful card, I think it's okay to run in more high-powered casual games. If you're asking why I'm only talking about this card here, spoilers, other cards similar to this made it in the actual top 10. Necropotence and Bolas's Citadel are black cards that let you use your life as a resource in an extremely efficient manner. Unlike Heuristic Studies, these cards don't interact with your opponents. You can go crazy with them to your heart's content. But Necropotence doesn't allow you to cast your spells for free, and when you use it, you may fly too close to the sun, setting yourself up for lethal attacks. Bolas's Citadel instead self-polices itself, restricting you to the top card of your library. If you don't have particular synergies with it, it may even get you nothing, and again, it costs a lot of life to use. Since both drain your life total really fast, and in casual games you usually don't have cards that close the game immediately, while being some of the most powerful options, I feel like they belong in the format. Lastly, before we reach the actual top 10, I wanted to talk about the new Elesh Norn. This card is extremely pushed, like admittedly by the mythics in the last few years. But unlike many others, she really fits in a ton of decks and slows down most opponents while entirely turning off some strategies like Blink and Landfall. But I believe that her price tag, combined with the fact that most Commander players enjoy variety, you won't include this card in every white deck. because while it would be rarely incorrect to play her, she isn't such an evergreen advantage like a direct card draw or ramp option. She's gonna show up a lot and will always be very impactful or removed immediately. But I don't believe Elish Norn, Mother of the Machines, will be as ever-present as others fear she will be. That's why I don't think she should be banned. And finally, to the top 10. At the bottom, I placed Deflecting SWAT. As I mentioned with Flawless Maneuver, cards should cost mana or have an hard to meet requirement to be free, which this card lacks. The reason why I believe the SWAT is more powerful than Maneuver is thanks to his versatility. While it doesn't do the one thing Maneuver does, which is protecting from board wipes, it can redirect any effect. Someone points a removal spell at you, you point back at them. Someone tries to counter one of your spells, you make them counter this card instead. Someone is reanimating a big haymaker, redirecting to that Llanowar elf. Someone is casting an aura on his commander, redirecting to yours. This card has all the problems Flawless Maneuver has, but it is a lot stronger. For this reason, I place it on number 10 on the list. At number 9, we got Mana Drain. This card, for those who don't know, is a counterspell that rewards you with a bunch of colorless mana for spending double blue to counter a spell. This card is banned in Legacy for a very good reason. Ramping is something blue struggles with besides using artifacts. This is a premium costed counterspell that also gets you a huge following turn for literally no cost. Regular counterspell is a respectable and solid card, and this is just strictly better. Imagine if Path to Exile will let the caster get a basic land instead of the creature controller. This card is a top tier interaction piece that gives out a bunch of mana on top of it for some reason. That's why it's number 9 on the list. At number 8, we got another blue card in Cyclonic Rift. The most powerful board wipe in the format by a large margin, answering any non-land permanent with any kind of protection short of phased out ones at instant speed. In a pinch, it can even act as a single target bounce. Outside of counterspells, there are very few cards that let you play around it. The only redeeming factor is that it's heavily telegraphed, being a 7 mana instant. But having a board wipe that only blue players can interact with and that hits every no-land permanent is not fine. Even if you're holding a phase-out effect, like a Teferi's Protection, you'll still be unable to use your no-land permanents for the turn, since obviously they'll be phased out. So, not even such a card is a valid answer to Cyclonic Rift. For this reason, this card is number 8. At number 7, I placed Jeska's Will. This card provides way too much advantage for its cost. If you meet the extremely tough requirement of having your commander out, you get to exile and possibly play the top 3 cards of your deck, and includes lands because it's play not cast, and also to gain red mana based on the amount of cards target opponent has. Disregarding the occasional situation when someone has 10 plus cards in hand and you go crazy with this, it's very likely that out of 3 opponents you get at least 5 mana out of the effect, making this a ritual that also gets you new cards to spend the extra mana you just made. Being able to do the 2 most powerful things in Commander together for just 3 mana makes this card an auto include in every possible red deck imaginable. Maybe discarding 4 and 5 color decks? But even then, I'd still consider it if you aren't playing something like Charmed Tribal. So, Jeska's Will makes number 7 on the list. At number 6, we go on with cards that cost no mana for some reason. I cheated a little bit, including 2 cards, because I felt like these were very similar on power level. Force of Will and Fierce Guardianship. Mana Drain is a counterspell that cheats mana on the back end of the deal. This, too, do so in the front end, virtually ramping you the regular mana cost earlier. Force of Will is more flexible, being able to counter creatures. The requirement to exile a blue card from hand, I find it a little harder than having your commander out. So I would say that they are about even on power level. Everything I said earlier for the floating slot is valid here as well. These can answer even more than the red card can. And unlike other free counter spells that exist in the format, they are still very good in their own right, namely Pact of Negation and Force of Negation. They carry less drawbacks. The Pact of Negation forces you to pay those 5 mana afterwards. So even if you get a free counter spell on the front end, you have to pay a premium of 5 mana for that counter afterwards, or otherwise you lose the game. And the Force of Negation is restricted to non-creature spells like Guardianship, but it cannot be used for free during your turn, allowing your opponents to interact with you more freely in that time lapse. This is why I placed Force of Will and Fierce Guardianship at number 6. I decided to give spot 5 to Jeweled Lotus. This card isn't as strong as other cards on the list, but the reason I place it this high is because it's miserable. Either you draw it early and cast your commander 3 turns ahead of everybody else and run away with the game, or you do it and it gets removed immediately, putting you down a card and you end up extremely far behind. Option 3 is you draw this card late and it pays for 1.5 tax, which is good but nothing insane. At this point you got the drill. 0 mana card bad. This, on top of that, is just plain bad design and was made solely to sell packs, cause it mimics Black Lotus and everybody knows how strong that card is. Don't waste your money on Jeweled Lotus, this is a bad imitation, and that's why I put it at number 5 on the list. Barely out of the podium, there's Gaia's Cradle. This is the classic one card people warn you about they have proxied before the game, if they run any. I'm all about proxying magic cards. Hell, the main thing of this channel is about playing with unofficial cards. But stop gaslighting yourself. Gaia's Cradle is the prime example of a pay-to-win card. Any deck that plays creatures will enjoy adding these cards to its mana base. Comes untapped, adds colored mana, and even discounting untapping shenanigans is gonna generate way more mana than it has any right to for what it requires. If you want to have this effect in a fair card, Growing Rites of Itlimok exists and is a very solid card in its own right. I understand the fact that you may want to play with this if it sits in your collection, but you should do so only in very high power tables or in competitive formats. That's the reason why Gaia's Cradle takes the 4th spot on the list. At number 3 we find Smothering Tithe. Why have I placed Smothering Tithe all the way up here if Rhystic Study hasn't even made top 10, you would ask? First, the study hasn't made it, but just barely. Second, unlike the blue enchantment, this one doesn't give you a choice. Paying 1 mana to stop your opponent from drawing a card is a very reasonable deal. Paying 2 mana to stop an opponent from creating a treasure token is unreasonable. You are almost never able to play around Smothering Tithe. You need to be out of cards or floating multiple mana doubling permanents in play to pay for it. Third, you can't force your opponents to play their cards in a way they can't pay the tax, but you can very easily force them to draw more cards than they can pay for. Will effects give you 21 Smothering Tithe triggers, and even without bothering red or blue for maximum abuse, staying in mono white allows very mediocre cards that makes you and your opponent draw cards essentially free. Worst case scenario, you make 3 mana of any color you can accumulate every turn. With literally no synergy with artifacts or treasures and no opponents that draw cards, this would still be the best, or at least among the best ramp options at 4 mana. And it is so much more than that. This card takes top 3 for this reason. At number 2, a repeat the stunt I made at the number 6, placing two very similar cards in the same spot. These are Mana Crypt and Sol Ring. The Sol Ring debate has plagued the internet since many years. And much like Brainstorm for Legacy, the only argument I will buy for it not being banned is the fact that it is so iconic to the format that it gained diplomatic immunity at this point. It will also make every pre-constructed deck immediately illegal out of the box, and that would not be ideal. Other than that, both Sol Ring and Mana Crypt have the same problems Jeweled Lotus has times 2. Like the Lotus, they are extremely undercosted for the advantage they bring, and even if your first big threat gets answered, they stick around to power out the next one. Since everyone plays with Sol Ring, you must have witnessed many games going turn 1 Sol Ring into 2 Mana Rock into dominating the game from start to finish. I've played many of those. Mana Crypt is even more powerful, allowing you to have 3 mana on turn 1. I was tempted to put Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond along with them, but between forcing you to exile a card and giving out 1 mana instead of 2, I feel like they carry more risks and less power. So while I would be wary of any opponents who plays them, these aren't as impactful. The fact that they are legal in Legacy also supports my theory on them being less powerful cards. That said, Mana Crypt and Sol Ring are definitely number 2. Number 1 will surprise no one. Everybody knew it was coming, it's in the thumbnail. Dockside Extortionist. I wouldn't put this card in a casual deck even if I was playing Monocle Tribal. It's 2 mana, it's a creature, creates way more mana than it costs with no effort, and it does so with an ATB. Almost every time this guy hits the battlefield, the game is either immediately sealed, turned on its head, or becomes a race for who can copy or reanimate it the most times. All cards in this list, besides Cyclonic Rift, generate or cheat mana. Obviously, the most broken of them all sits at the top. Dockside Extortionist is a prime example of why games aren't as fun when you don't play by the rules as intended. I don't know where people play when they say this guy doesn't show up in casual games, because I see him a lot, and I believe that if actual friggin' Black Lotus was legal in the format, Dockside Extortionist would still be the most powerful card. And that was my top 10 cards that shouldn't appear in casual Commander games. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know your own top 10 down in the comments. This was Iv. Thanks for watching.